You are showing another application window. Stop sharing. Okay, sorry, that didn't work, did it? Okay, can you see that now?
No, there is an option present now.
Okay, where is that option?
There is an option present now.
Oh, yes. Okay. Right, can you see that now? I don't think so. Try it again. Share.
No.
Share
No.
my entire
Should
screen. Let's see if that works. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, allow. No. Oh. Okay, right. Can you, it says you're showing another application window, but can you see this PowerPoint slide? It says responses to language endangerment.
It's fine. Yeah, we can see now.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Phew. Okay, so Susanna Main wrote in 2008 about the responses that there are to language endangerment among various sectors of the population. And it seems that for some people, especially governments, they see that, they perceive that if they do nothing, languages will disappear, and therefore there'll be no more problem, if you like, with what they see as a problem of people speaking different languages, and that there is an orientation sometimes towards multilingualism being seen as a problem. But if we do that as academics, if we sit on the fence, what will happen will be that the loss of linguistic diversity will continue. And as a society, SEL, of course, is interested in maintaining linguistic diversity. The main response of academia has been to document languages before they disappear, and there has been a big push in the last 20 years. And various archives have opened up around the world, and there have been various funding programs to promote the documentation of endangered languages. But I think we have to think about who this is done for, because I think...
Professor, sorry to stop you. Could you please press F5 in order to enlarge the size of the slides, because they are not clearly visible.
Ooh, F4.
They're not clearly visible. F5 or F4. I don't know. There's an option.
F5.
I do probably with F5.
For me, it's full screen, but I don't know what's happening here. Can you see that?
12 screen.
Okay, let me go to escape.
Okay, now you can go. You can go with that.
Okay, so is this okay now?
It's the same.
I really don't know. I never used Google Present before, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we all are familiar with Zoom, but unfortunately, I had a problem yesterday.
Professor, may I help? Professor,
Hello?
may I help?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, please.
Hello. If you open from your PowerPoint slide on the reading mode, if you click the reading mode on your PowerPoint slide,
where do I find that?
Below your, no, not here.
Okay.
You go back and down below there are four icons. You can see
At the bottom here, this one.
Yes.
Reading view. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So how is that?
Yes, great. We can see it.
Oh, okay, brilliant. Well done. Thank you. I didn't know about that. Okay, great. Okay, so, pardon. Okay, so I'm on to option 2, the academic response to language endangerment, the documenting of endangered languages. As I said, we have to think about who this is being done for. I think in many cases, academics are really doing it for ourselves. To get a record of, let's say, interesting linguistic features before they disappear, so to have them available for academic study. And that doesn't really help the people who are speaking the languages or who would like to speak the languages, the communities who identify with those languages. Because I think in many cases, academic language archives aren't really very accessible to people in language communities who don't have linguistic training. Okay. On the other hand, the third response to language endangerment across the world increasingly is to promote language maintenance and revitalization. And this is primarily the response of communities, as I say, who identify and who are involved with languages, and who are losing those languages, and in many cases are feeling quite strong feelings of grief about losing those languages, but really not sure about what to do with it, about it. And actually, language revitalization has been going on for longer than language documentation, since the 1970s in some cases. But it is increasingly popular around the world, and especially in Asia, I found in various countries, Japan, Korea, India, and Pakistan as well now. Okay, and I think that linguists have an ethical responsibility. If we work with people in language communities, particularly if we collect data from those people, we have a responsibility to help them conduct language revitalization, language maintenance in the most effective way possible. So I think this is why it's a valuable thing to do, to actually study the processes of language endangerment, to see the best way of supporting that. Okay, so language revitalization is an emergent field of study. I've been working quite hard to get it accepted in academia as a valid field of study. There are some linguists who dismiss this, they call it things like linguistic social work. But I think if you think about it as a subfield of the sociology of language, we can identify trends and models, as people do in sociology, in regard to social groups. Because we can see the replication of similar approaches and problems around the world, because people often have often assume, for example, that the best way to go is schools. I'll come back to that in a minute. But what we found is that there's really not yet a lot of evaluation of language revitalization projects and programs. I think people often avoid doing evaluation in case they might not like what they find. So that means there's not a lot of coordinated thinking on how we can learn from our experiences, from our successes, and also from our setbacks. So I'm particularly interested in looking at how language revitalization is experienced on the ground by people involved. So this is kind of bottom-up language planning and policy, rather than looking at it from a top-down governmental level. I'm also interested in the kinds of ideologies of language and also the ideologies of society that are revealed by examining the processes and discourses in language revitalization, what people say about their language. And I'm also particularly interested in the goals of language revitalization, both people, what people say what they want to achieve, and also what they don't say they want to achieve, but actually may actually be an unstated goal of language revitalization activities. And that, of course, relates to the processes I mentioned earlier, and also to the outcomes of language revitalization. So, for example, a lot of communities say that they want to re-establish their language as a language in the family and as an important language in the community. But the way they go about that may not be effective in actually producing the stated goal that they want. And I think it's really important to look at those processes to see how we can improve the outcomes. So this is a work in progress. I've got a small grant at the moment from the British Academy to compare language revitalization around the world, and it's very small, so I've actually applied for a larger grant from the European Union, and I won't hear about that for some time, I'm afraid. Yeah, but we'll see what we can do in the next year or two. Okay, so here are just a few places around the world. There are many, many more than this, but I thought I would show that there is a spread all around the world in various places. And I've included a couple of languages that I've heard about. I don't know them personally in Pakistan, and I know there are other languages that people are working with and trying to support. And I've deliberately got this map which has an Asia-Pacific focus rather than the Eurocentric focus of most maps. So you can see that there are language revitalization programs going on, or some kind of activity anyway, in all parts of the world, but north and south, east and west. And as I said, we can identify certain themes coming up in language revitalization. First of all, education, especially with children, but also with adults. It's very important to focus on adult education, language learning. I'll come back to that later. And I think people focus on education partly because children are cute and they enjoy teaching children, working with children, but also because it's a response to the low status of many endangered languages, and to have it the language and accepted in the school is seen as an important part of it, increasing the prestige of that language. And that leads us on to the second point, which is raising awareness, particularly getting official recognition of a language, but also through things like performing in public. Got an example of that from Pakistan. Raising public awareness of your language through presentations, plays, dancing, singing, etc. And also through what we call the linguistic landscape, which is generally taken to mean the print environment. So signposts, for example, in various languages. I understand that in Pakistan, most signposts are in Urdu and English, and that there are very few signs written in local languages. But in order to do that, of course, you have to have a written form for your language. Thirdly, we move on to community language use. Not just use in education, not just use in what we might call symbolic spaces, but also actual use in the family, in the community, and socializing with using a language. The fourth theme that we can identify in language revitalization is relating language to wider socioeconomic issues. And I think this is increasingly important, such as the environment and development. People are often more worried. If you ask people what really worries them, this is things like this, socioeconomic issues, rather than language in itself only. Language is always not, actually language policy is very often not about language itself. It's about other issues that are represented by language. And fifthly, again, increasingly, we're getting much more linking of language with empowerment, both personal empowerment and also community empowerment. I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples that we found around the world. But this is increasingly linked to the decolonization movement. My university is particularly keen on decolonizing research. Reclaiming our linguistic heritage in order to empower ourselves and our communities. I'll come back to that. Okay, so here are a few examples. This is one of the most famous examples of language revitalization, what's called the language nests in Hawaii. Because basically one of the key defining features of an endangered language is that it's not being used in the family anymore, particularly the parents' generation, the middle generation don't speak the language. Sometimes children can learn it from their grandparents. We have several examples of that, but very often the school has to step in. It's projected, it's proposed that school can step in as a way to replace the family as a means of transmitting the language to the younger generation. But it has been recognized that really you need a lot of input as a child to learn a language. Children are actually not very effective language learners. They do need a lot of input. And so in these schools, they start really young, like age 2 or 3. And they do everything throughout the day through the medium of Hawaiian. Okay, and here's an example from Pakistan. This is a much more formal approach to education. This is mother tongue based multilingual education, which is slightly different to revitalization through language, because if you use the term mother tongue, it implies that actually the children do actually speak that language, although I know in many places mother tongue, actually your native language, can mean your heritage language, which may or may not be actually spoken by the children. But in this particular context, I think it's assumed that the children do actually speak and understand the language, but it's not always the case. So often children are put into education in a language that they don't understand. Here's another example from Thailand. These are teaching materials that have been produced in a language, very small minority language called Nyakur. And these are what we call big books, and they're quite popular. It means that you don't have to produce a lot of small books if you don't have a lot of resources, but they're very popular for storytelling sessions in schools. And these are based on traditional tales, and you can see that they are hand produced and very nicely decorated, but they are clearly less professional than the materials that are produced for majority languages. And sometimes if you do this, children notice that the materials for a minority language are not as good as the materials for a majority language, a national language. And that, you know, obviously that can impact their own perceptions of the importance of that language or not. Yeah. Okay. In the linguistic landscape, it's an example from the British Isles, another small island between England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Isle of Man has its own language, which actually the last speaker died in 1974. But they have had a particularly, I think, successful language revitalization movement. So one of the things that they do, especially on public signs, is that there's now a policy to replace, I think I've got another example here, yes, to replace signs. When they wear out, they're replaced in bilingually. And that is a kind of cost-neutral approach to increasing the visibility of the language around the island. Here is an example from Korea, thanks to our former PhD student Sung-woo Kim, who studied the Jejuan language for his PhD. So here is the use of the Jejuan language, which is an island right to the south of Korea, in advertising. And obviously advertisers will only do this if they think it's going to make them money, and they are sort of piggybacking on the increased popularity of local language and identity. Here in Poland, a very small language in the south of Poland called Vymisyrish. And these are the, let's say, more elderly members of the revitalization movement, but you can see some younger members in the back. And they're very keen on promoting their culture, and particularly their local costume, which was actually banned in the 1950s. So wearing the local costume is really important part of their identity, and also speaking the language. They promote many parts of their culture together. And they've got this singing and theatre group, which has actually become so successful that they have presented plays in the capital in Warsaw in the National Theatre. This is my own heritage language, Januzye, which is surprisingly difficult for many people to pronounce. Yeah. And this photo actually comes from the local newspaper. So again, showing that demonstrations of local language and identity can be seen as quite attractive for the tourists. In this case, you can see a tourist on the left taking a photo, but also for raising awareness just of local identity in the local society. This parade is actually a part of an annual festival which brings together speakers of the related Norman languages from all the different islands and also from the mainland. And you can see that, well, some of these people are wearing local costumes and some of them are not. And some of them are just wearing generic old style clothes, which can sometimes be a problem. Again, I'll come back to that later. If you present your language as something from the past, you're not presenting it as something that could be spoken in the present or the future. Okay, and here's an example from Pakistan. I don't know if any of you know this particular example, and it's actually interesting because you can see that in the background you have someone dressed in modern clothes and wearing sunglasses, who looks a bit like a tourist, but I don't actually know the context here. But apparently in this village, musicians have been very, very low status and spoke a language whose name actually meant low caste people. So the people who want to, the community are actually using language both for self-expression, but also to raise the awareness and the status of both the community and the language. So this is linking language with community development and with empowering the local community. And what they've done is actually to invent a new name for their language, very similar to the old name. so that it's not so associated with the low status. Okay, and here we go back to Korea, another example of a performance in the language. This is a children's speech contest in the Jejuan language. We have this kind of thing in Guernsey as well. But what we actually find, what happens is that the children learn these performances off by heart, but they don't actually speak the language themselves. Sometimes they don't even know what they're saying. So this is not really part of, we can say this is part of performing your language rather than speaking your language. And just another example here, this is from Southeast Alaska in the USA, where there are a number of small heritage languages, or what they call ancestral languages in the US. This is an immersion retreat, which means that people who want to learn their language and to speak it well actually go away for a week or so, and they speak only that language during that time, and they don't have a lot of connection with the outside world. And you can see here they're doing an activity. I think they're doing looking at a picture of traditional activities, and as part of what they do in these retreats is they learn, or they relearn, how to do traditional crafts, for example. But this is an example of actually trying to use the language in everyday life and to learn how to use it for communication. Okay, and finally, I think I've got another example from my own language, Jeunessier, of people trying to promote Jeunessier for conversation and socializing. So there's every month or so there's a meeting, and really every month, one evening a month is not really enough, frankly, to get fluent in the language, but it helps you to stay fluent. So they have regular meetings in cafes, in pubs, in community centers, in hotels, anywhere they can find a room that they can hire, both cheaply or freely, to practice speaking the language. Okay, so then another one at a cafe last June. Here's me. I'm doing some participant observation in one of, and I'm wearing a t-shirt as well in the language. And here's one of the groups. Some of I know in some places, and also in this community, some of the women don't feel too happy about going to pubs. They don't feel too happy about socializing with men. So they have their own group to chat in their language. And here we have a young lady and her grandmother who are getting together to try to reestablish, to try to reconnect using their heritage language. Okay, and back to Thailand. Here we are documenting traditional knowledge in the Nyakua language. In this place, the community forest is very, very, very important, and the traditional ecological knowledge is very important to the local community. And they notice that people are losing that knowledge, so they are trying to create handbooks and guidelines. And so guidebooks for people who want to learn more about both the food and the medicinal properties of plants in their community forest. Okay. There have, back to more theory, there have been debates, and there have been debates for some time about approaches and models in language revitalization. Right back to 1991, Joshua Fishman, who was a major figure in this field, his 1991 book, Reversing Language Shift, really did a lot to raise awareness of language endangerment and language revitalization. And he really pushed the idea of language, the family, what he called the family community nexus as the core of language revitalization. And he said, without intergenerational mother tongue transmission, no language maintenance is possible. But I think what a lot of us find is that actually people recognize that they do need to have other languages too. Sometimes there's a kind of monolingual approach to language revitalization to try to get children or only to speak a minority language. But the trouble is that families actually know that their children will need Urdu or English, for example, in their lives or in education. And so that kind of leads to a sort of tension, and often then the families don't actually follow the recommended policy of only using the minority language. So I think we have to think about the needs of the children, and also whether it's realistic aim to reinstate a language which is no longer used as a primary medium of socialization in the community. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to use it amongst ourselves for socialization, but we shouldn't push, let's say, a monolingual approach on children. We should recognize that they do need to be multilingual in modern society. So Suzanne Romain, in a different paper, suggested that we need to question the assumptions and theoretical perspectives underlying language revitalization. And this is really what got me thinking a long time ago now about approaches to language revitalization. Because what Romain pointed out, that actually, although many revitalization movements say that they want to reinstate intergenerational transmission in the family, what they actually do is focus on schools. And she pointed out that actually that is quite expensive compared to natural transmission in the family, because you have to reinvest in every generation in the school, or every year in the school. Okay, so as I said, there's often this focus on schools in language revitalization. As I mentioned, Joshua Fishman advised revitalizers to focus on the home and the community because that, he said, is the most important thing to secure first, and schools and higher language domains can wait. So prestige, for example, can wait. Just get your language secure in the community. But as Suzanne Romain pointed out, many language movements ignore his advice and they focus on schools. As I mentioned, it's often seen as important for raising the status of the language. I mentioned the language nests in Hawaii. These are an example of immersion, teaching or so-called mother tongue education. That is, or the medium of education is the language that wants to be revitalized, but it does require significant investment, particularly in terms of the teachers who have to be fluent in the language and also to know the subjects. And we also find that if a child goes to school in a language and doesn't actually use that language outside school, they don't actually know always. Very often they don't continue using it after they've left school. It was hoped that teaching the children the language in the school would encourage them to then use it among their friends, and then perhaps start a family and use the language with their family. That what we find is that actually they don't necessarily know intimate language. I'll come back to that in a minute. They know academic language. Okay. And in many places, as I mentioned, because immersion teaching, mother tongue education is actually quite expensive, you need a lot of materials as well, people opt for extracurricular clubs, language clubs. Unfortunately, these are actually really very unsuccessful at teaching the language to any level of fluency, simply because you may only have half an hour a week, which is not enough to activate any kind of language learning mechanism in children's brains. And often the teaching is not very effective because then the teachers are not trained. They're often elderly people, native speakers, retired people, and they often, in fact, themselves have not actually had a lot of exposure to teaching, to education at all themselves. And the implicit message that children get from this is that our language is not good enough for the proper part of the curriculum. Yeah, if it's relegated to after school, a club on the par with a football club, and often these language clubs are competing with other after school clubs for the children's attention. Okay. So as I said, there are problems with this, but there are definitely a lack of trained fluent teachers. There's even a lack, if there's a lack of trained teachers to teach English around the world, you can imagine there's much bigger problem with teaching a very small language that doesn't have any speakers of adult age. Often these teachers are what we call semi or latent speakers. So they may have heard the language when they were young, but they don't actually speak it very, very fluently. So they don't have a lot of confidence in speaking. So they don't use the language very spontaneously in the classroom, which then transfers to the learners who don't really learn to speak it spontaneously either. As I mentioned, older speakers may not have much experience of formal education, or they may not be very familiar with modern communicative language methods, teaching methods. And if children are exposed to more modern teaching methods at school, they may find teaching methods in after school or even Saturday clubs that we have in the UK for teaching minority languages. They may not find them very attractive. Okay, and as I mentioned, the school language teaching often doesn't lead to fluency or use outside the school because children can talk about academic subjects, but not about everyday things or intimate things like, I love you, let's make a baby and speak our language with it. But often the focus is on writing as well, rather than speaking the language in school. So we get what we call domain shift, away from the domestic home community nexus that Fishman promoted, towards the academic domain. So I think really we need languages to leave school if we want to actually, I mean, it's great to actually teach languages in schools, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we need to do it effectively and in a way that encourages children to use the languages outside school. Okay, so here's another example from Guernsey. This is a language awareness class, mainly for toddlers, but also for some older children. And you can see there's lots of fun painting activities, lots of mess going on here. But the idea is to use the language while children are doing these activities. So it's an activity what we call task-based learning. It's great. This is very similar to the kind of thing they do in the language nests in Hawaii, but it only happens about every 6 weeks for about 45 minutes. And again, it's not enough to activate language learning mechanisms, but some people actually think it will. And that's another danger if you rely on classes which are not very frequent and not very effective. And that sometimes some parents think that, okay, the school is doing that. We don't have to bother. We don't have to worry about learning the language ourselves. Okay. I mentioned performances, promotion of language in the environment and so on. As you can see, this is an example from Guernsey again. These people are dressed up. This is a singing group. This actually is one of the oldest language revitalization groups that I know about. They were founded in 1936. A group of people who wanted to promote their language and keep it going and keep their identity and culture going, which is great. But they tend to dress up in old-fashioned clothes. And I think this gives an impression of that the language is a language of the past and therefore is not very attractive to young people. And if you don't have young people wanting to speak your language, then the prospects for that language are not particularly good. The other problem that you often find with this focus on the past is that it often entails purism and ideologies of correctness, which again will often criticize the use of younger people, or what we call youth speakers. And then, of course, if you criticize people for the way they use their heritage language, they might turn around and say, oh, well, I can speak English better than you anyway, so I'm not going to speak this language at all. So Adrian Kane, I have a lot of respect for him. He used to be Manx Language Development Officer. He now teaches in a Manx medium school, an immersion school in the Isle of Man. He wrote to me, he said, language awareness raising isn't an end in itself. And if it doesn't encourage people to learn and speak it, then it hasn't worked. And I think this is a really important thing to remember, that we need to combine a lot of things. Even if we put a lot of energy into something, I mean, these festivals are really, really fun and they're lovely, and I really enjoy going to them. But once the festival is finished, people go off and speak English again. And I think we have to actually promote these performances as a way to get people using the language, not just as an event and then you go home. Okay. Now, I don't know, many of you will have heard of William Leboeuf, the so-called father of sociolinguistics. He had a paper in a book, the same book I quoted at the beginning, with the paper by Suzanne Romain. He pointed out that even if you save a language, it might not actually be helping the people who speak that language. Because sometimes, because people associate speaking a language with low status and discrimination, if you don't actually raise the status of the people along with the status of the language, then you're not doing them any favors. And we know that language shift around the world is connected to socioeconomic problems, social injustice, discrimination, and poverty. And you don't really get language shift if you don't have a minoritized population. And a lot of people have written about this. There's a book called Language and Poverty, which is really interesting. Okay, and so we're seeing increasing evidence through research in the last 15 years or so of the benefits of language revitalization for empowerment of communities, for well-being, and actually the health of minorities. So people have made, people like Hallett et al., Chandler and Lalonde, Doug Whalen, particularly in Canada and Australia, looking at the health of Indigenous people and looking at links between the availability of a language revitalization program. And in Canada, they've seen a correlation between involvement in language revitalization and lowering the rates of youth suicide, because it has been found that Indigenous people have higher rates of suicide than majority populations. And in, being involved in language revitalization can actually give you more self-confidence in that, and so avoiding mental health problems, for example. And in Australia, they have found links between rates of diabetes, another pervasive problem for Indigenous people there, and language. So people involved in language revitalization, they have found apparently have lower rates of diabetes. So this is increasing evidence in this respect. Okay, so these are concrete reasons for promoting endangered languages. And Lorraine has pointed out in the paper I quoted at the beginning, when we lose sight of the people and the communities that sustain languages, it becomes easy to argue, as a number of people have, that there's no reason to preserve languages for their own sake. So why are we doing this? It's not just for the language, it's not just for the convenience of linguists to have something to study, we're actually doing it to help people. Okay. And therefore, I think it's important to try to integrate language and sustainable development. So my collaborator, Jeanette King, has written about how reclaiming and raising the status of a heritage language can also be very personally empowering. She talks about people involved in Maori language revitalization in New Zealand saying, I'm revitalizing myself through learning my heritage language. And that way we can challenge ideologies of deficit associated with minority languages, like, for example, the people in Mominabad in northern Pakistan. Okay, so going back to the goals, Fishman in 1991, a lot of people didn't really take notice of what Fishman was saying, and I think we do need to, saying basically that people get exhausted. People get burnt out if they try and do language revitalization activities that really don't get them anywhere. He calls that struggles on the wrong front, without real awareness of what they were doing or the problems that faced them. And this is, I think, why it's really important to study language revitalization movements, to find out what works, what doesn't, or what might be transferable to another place, because you have to take it into account, of course, that there are different cultural factors and different political factors in the different places around the world. But other people have looked at this too. Grenoble and Whaley, in their book Saving Languages 2006, said that if you try to identify goals for language revitalization, you need to think about who is being targeted, the level of language proficiency that we want to bring about, how good do you want to be, and the intended domains in which the local language will be used. So what do you want to use it for? So who, how good, and why, essentially, where do you want to use your language? And I think people often really don't think about this kind of thing. And often the examples that we get in the textbooks are things like Hawaiian, Maori language revitalization in New Zealand. They're often big, mother tongue education, often big officially supported projects with relatively large amounts of resources. Whereas many community projects are quite small and what we call scatterguns. So they don't really think a lot about planning and evaluation when, if they do any kind of planning at all. They just get really enthusiastic. We've got to do something to save our language, but they don't really think about how they want to do it, what they want to do it for, and where they want to use it. Okay, so Fishman talked about what he called prior ideological clarification. So he had, I don't know if you know his graded intergenerational disruption scale, which is catalogues the different levels of use in a society of a language. And he says you can really only use this as a tool if you have identified, he doesn't actually define what he means by ideological clarification. So this is what I think it is. It's basically what Grenoble and Wendy was saying. So what do we want to do revitalization for? How do we go about it? Who decides on those goals? Is it democratic, or is it the elders who decide? Is it the young people who decide? What kind of language and culture are we trying to preserve or revive? And is it effective? And how do we measure that? Over how long a period? How good how proficient do we want to be in this language, and how do we measure that? Because we probably don't have a full description of these languages if they're very highly endangered. And we need these kind of arguments so that we can respond to critics, because there are going to be people who say, why do you want to save this small, silly language? It's no use anymore to anybody. Nobody else speaks it. It's no good in the world. I'm sure we've all heard this kind of argument. So we need to have arguments ourselves in order to respond to these criticisms. And one of the things we can say is about the importance of traditional language for identity, for well-being, and for empowerment. Okay. And I mentioned sociology earlier, and in sociology, it has been found that groups, and particularly people who studied things like religious movements, they have been found to develop in predictable ways. So, for example, Bruce, 1999, found a kind of cyclical stages in the development of particular religious groups. And we can also identify common stages or discourses in language revitalization. So one of them is we have to get our language into the schools, and I've actually heard people say this for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It's seen as the way to teach language, but also to get higher status. The next thing you often hear is that we need a language app. And this has been talked about for 20 years or so as well, what's called the technical fix. Then we get movements that say, the government should save our language. We have to get the language recognized, and we have to get signposts in our language, and we have to get schools in our language, and the government should do this. We need funding from the government. And we need signposts in the linguistic landscape. We need to get our language more visible. Well, not just audible, visible. But what you might think is that actually people often do this because they don't actually have a lot of confidence in speaking the language themselves. So I talked to a guy in Guernsey who's has been quite active in the language revitalization movement. And I asked him, do you speak the language with your children? He's my age. And he said, oh no, I haven't got the confidence to speak the language with my family. And I thought, well, you teach it in the school, but what happens is what I said earlier is, but in a school, it's a relatively kind of predictable language environment, and you don't have to do anything off the cuff and a thing improvised. So you can prepare what you say in advance, and you can do the same with performing. That's why it's easier to perform than it is to speak a language. But also all these statements I've got here are basically asking somebody else to save the language: the schools, the app, the government, or the road signs, the linguistic landscape. And this can be seen as less challenging. Downhauer wrote a very influential, very important article in 1998 about this. It's less challenging than actually changing your own behavior. That can be quite difficult. Yeah, as I mentioned, this guy said this, not confident enough to use the language with my children. I thought that was really sad. Yeah. So what we need to take into account, getting towards the end here, what do we need to take into account when we're trying to plan language maintenance? It's kind of synthesizing the research so far. Okay, so language policy at the various levels, we do have to take into account both right down from international level, you know, what languages are seen as the most important around the world, right down to local and even family level of language policy. Why do parents choose to speak certain languages or not with their children? Or how can we persuade parents to pass on their heritage languages to their children? We need to think about what are achievable, appropriate goals, both short-term and long-term. You need to have aspirations for what your long-term goal is, but you also need to actually have things that you can do and get success with and feel better and then go on to the next thing. You need to think about language attitudes, language ideologies. If people don't believe their language is worth saving, then they're not going to do it. They're not going to take part. You need to think about the vitality of the language. What are the language resources? How many people speak this language? Do we have any teachers? Do we have any adults that speak the language? And how confident are they in using that language? Yeah, because if you don't have people who are confident enough to use it in the family or in the schools, then you have to train those people. But also rhetoric and communication are actually quite important. Public relations for your language movement. You will probably need funding if you want to have any kind of materials for your language. And that may have to come from the dominant language community. If the government is going to support your language, they're going to use it through taxes, and therefore the people who pay those taxes need to be on side. You need to have rhetoric that will attract funding from dominant language organizations while also empowering language communities, so not taking the initiative away from the people who are actually going to use the language. So some of you may have seen an earlier version of this graph in my 2013 book, and at that point only had about 3 arrows, but you can see it's getting more complicated because I found out more and more things happening around the world. But you can actually divide this into 2 halves. On the right, you've got kind of top-down language policy. And it's a way, what I kind of refer to perhaps as more static language ideology. So expecting the government or other people to do something about your language, focusing on the language rather than linking it with other parts of life, with culture, with community activities, and with empowerment and development and so on. Then we have this monolingual idea that I mentioned earlier, only speak this language and don't bring in majority languages that the children will need in the long term. Focusing on emblematic symbolic cues through signposts, through performances and so on. And also focusing on the prestige and status of the language. Again, all these things are important to do, but we have to remember that there's another end to these arrows. So on the opposite end of the prestige and status arrow, you've got family and community. It's really important to not forget that family and community are the nexus, the real core of language use. And therefore, what you need in order to promote language in the community is conversational fluency, not just emblematic and symbolic use. Yeah, not even just saying, hello, how are you? You need to go on from that and to be able to talk about more than just the weather. So instead of just promoting one language, you need to think about people's repertoires, people's linguistic repertoires. Most people around the world are multilingual and use different languages at different times for different purposes. And what I think we need to do is to re-establish a niche in that repertoire for the local language. Because language is not just about language, it's not just for linguists, it's for life and for empowerment, for challenging these deficit ideologies. And for that reason, we need to focus not just on top-down language policy, but also on bottom-up language policy, individual language policies, which languages we choose to learn, which languages we choose to speak with our friends and with our families. And if we want to think about where sustainable language revitalization sits, I think it's slightly more to the left-hand side of this diagram, because really it's communities and people that speak languages. It's not governments and signposts. Okay, so in conclusion, I think many people don't do what Fishman called prior ideological clarification. Most people in community-based projects don't do a lot of planning and evaluation, but I think we can do that in retrospect in order to learn, perhaps and to share our findings with people around the world. And these findings, as I mentioned, are evolving, and they have evolved since and over the last few years. As I mentioned, my diagram has got more complicated. At least I've been finding out a lot more things happening in different parts of the world. So I think we can, at the moment, look at outcomes of language revitalization on 3 levels. First of all, the languages themselves. I haven't talked about this much, but there's a lot of worry, let's say, about authenticity of languages. How are languages changing? Are they going to be the same language as our elders spoke? People worried that the children are not using the language in the correct way, that they're mixing their languages too much. And there is a movement in Europe, particularly, of what we call new speakers, people who want to learn and to use our heritage languages, or even people who don't come from that heritage, but who want to identify with the language community, and seeing them as valid speakers, not only seeing older people as the only people who are have legitimate users of a minority language. Excuse me. Then we can assess the activities that are involved in language revitalization. So what are the focuses? Education, community, etc. What levels of involvement are there? Who is involved in language revitalization? What are the curricula, school curricula? What are the teaching methods? How do people actually learn those languages? And thirdly, we can look at the social impact on the community, the beliefs, the attitudes, and the empowerment, the confidence of that community. And that is to do with the ideologies for society that are involved in language revitalization. And I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I'm sorry I've gone on for so long. I'm sorry about the problems at the beginning. I'm going to stop sharing, I think. How do I do that? Stop presenting. Okay, great. Phew. I'm going to drink the water again.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful session. If there is any question, please, you can unmute yourself and ask question. Or questions even.
You can write in. Is there a chat thing here? Some people don't feel confident about speaking.
Yeah, in a chat we have a question from Marian Isar.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see the question. Okay. Her question is, yeah, are language revitalization and language documentation the same thing? If yes, then why language documentation is important for the revival of a language?
Okay. Well, if we want to produce effective language materials, we really need to know what the language is like. So we need language documentation in order to actually know the language, so that we can prepare reliable language materials for language learning. And that's how language documentation can be useful for language revitalization. What we have to think about then, because many of us involved in language documentation tend to collect linguistic paradigms, things which are useful for linguists, and often we don't collect everyday language, things that will be, or childcare language, for example, things that will be useful for people who want to use the language in their community. So if we are doing language documentation, we have to think about real everyday language too, and make sure that we include that, and make sure that we make those materials accessible to the language community.
Yes, thank you. And again, a question from Maria. Anyhow, and how a community can play its role in language revitalization?
Oh gosh, well, community is the core of language revitalization. I'm thinking of language revitalization as a way to bolster a community, to support a community, to support community identity. in a village I've been working with in Thailand, the language and the culture seemed as very closely entwined, and they have been working very hard to document both the culture and the language and to build a community museum, because there's only one old lady really who knows a lot about the language and culture, and they recognize that she's not going to be around forever and she's getting more and more frail. So to do those things is it's actually brought the community together, and the young people have taken the lead in this, and it's actually helped the young people to develop transferable skills that they can use to get jobs in the future. So they're seeing the value of getting involved in community language and heritage development projects for their own careers as well.
Thank you. A question from Muhammad Asim Khan. Is language education policy effective in language promotion? Is there reference available which can tell us what effective schools institutions have been under different models of language in education?
Oh, there's a huge literature on this. And it really depends on which place and which approach. And it depends on the language policy. You say, is language education policy effective? I know there's actually a book produced by the British Council on teaching English in Pakistan. And that has actually come out as quite in favor of mother tongue education, because what is seen as generally most effective worldwide is focusing on the local language, the national language, and an international language. But doing it, all of that through the medium of those three languages at least. In many places do more than three languages, but three is perhaps a feasible number to focus on in schools. And with the they do this in the Basque Country in northern Spain, a highly minoritized language there. Very interesting language, Basque. It's a language isolate. And they do about 2/3 of this is in some schools, not every school. They do about 2/3 of the curriculum through the medium of Basque, about 1/4 through English, and a couple of hours a week of Spanish, which is the national language. And I asked them, don't the parents get worried that the children won't speak Spanish enough? And they said, well, actually, they get a lot of Spanish outside school. So that would be perhaps the role of Urdu in Pakistan. I don't know. It's not probably not the same. I think not so many people actually speak Urdu in Pakistan as Spanish in Spain. But you have to adjust that policy for the local situation. As I said, it's a rather top-down approach. You have to make sure that the teachers know enough of the language and know enough of the subject to teach both of them well. It's the quality of the education that's really, really important. And a policy is only as good as its implementation. Okay. I reckon I'll send a link to I think this British Council book is available free of charge online. So if I can find it, I'll send you a link to it, so you can share it with Mohammed Asim Khan.
All right, thank you for answering. Sabir Hussain is asking, are all the current languages are endangered? Can we say?
Sorry, which languages?
All the languages all the current languages are endangered? Can we say?
All of them? No, well, not big languages like English or Urdu, really, no. But in terms of numbers of languages, probably the majority of languages around the world are very small and probably therefore endangered. But it depends really on the local situation. I don't know exactly how many languages in Pakistan are endangered, but I know that in certain areas there are quite a lot of them. Yeah, there are attempts to count languages around the world. You probably know the Ethnologue resource. There's also another one called Glottolog, and the United Nations, UNESCO, had an atlas of endangered languages. I don't know how active it is now, but I think they're trying to revive it now, to review it and to revise that endangered language atlas. But each of these are only as good as the data that they hold. So if you talk about a linguist, if you talk about a language and a linguist will study a language and they'll say, oh, well, the information on ethnologue is not correct for my language. And the number of speakers they say is not correct for my language. It's really old data. But you have to report that so that they can improve their data. But I think, you know, there's a big tail, a long tail, so that there are a few languages spoken by millions of people, and then there are a lot of languages spoken by just a few people. And some of those are fine, but it depends on the situation. If there's pressure to assimilate, pressure to have education through a majority language, pressure to go to big city to get jobs, then those languages are gonna come under pressure. Okay. Okay, I think somebody's raised a hand. Are there any other questions, or can I ask? Okay, Mohammed Arsi. I'm just going to go down the list here, okay? You emphasize ideologies and goals as in your presentation. Are there other aspects of your language? Okay, yeah, I think the link between language and well-being and empowerment is really getting them to be the major theme that I'm seeing at the moment in language revitalization around the world. But I'm only at a very early stage. I would like to do a lot more study around the world of different places. Okay.
May I ask a question?
Okay, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I raised the hand before. I'm not sure if you noticed.
Yes, I saw. Yes, but there's a cube. Okay, go on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I want just to thank you for the great presentation. It was, as usual, very interesting. So I've got a question about the assessment of language revitalization. If we talk about revitalization planning, so if we take into consideration all of the methods which are available for us. How do we, are there any methods or ways to assess or to measure the effect different methods have on the revitalization process? Because of course, if we talk about, let's say, global approach to revitalization, if we apply different methods, then it's a little bit hard to understand which is working in language revitalization and which is not, and to what extent something is working. And my second kind of question, it is also connected to this problem. Do you think that UNESCO and Ethnologue language vitality scales, or how do we call them, ratings, are still relevant and they still can be used for tracking, monitoring the language revitalization? Thank you.
Okay, yes, lots of questions there. I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no one measure of success, because I think each activity and each program and each context has to be assessed, evaluated, I prefer, on its own merits, in its own terms. So that's why it's important to think about, first of all, where are we trying to get to and how are we trying to get there. And then when we've thought about that, we can think about actually, okay, how we got there and what might be good steps for getting there. I'm afraid I don't have, you know, any. Well, I have some questions that people can ask. You know, things like how many people do we want to be involved? What proportion of the community? What level of proficiency do we want them to get to? And how are we actually going to do that? In terms of methods, one that has been used quite effectively is what is called the master apprentice or mentoring approach, which puts people who want to learn a language or to recover a language, because often they're people who heard it when they were young but didn't actually develop fluency or haven't used it a lot. Often, so you can pair them with an older person, because often older people don't have anyone left to speak their language with. I talked to an old gentleman when I started my PhD research, and he said, I haven't had anyone to speak the language with since my wife died 5 years ago. And if you can get someone young who's really keen to learn the language, it can be beneficial for both parties. And that's, I think, a really useful way of trying to reconstitute social networks through a language. That's just one thing that has been tried increasing number of places around the world, started in North America, with Native American people, spread to Australia and many places around the world. And my students is doing this in Ryukyu Islands in the south of Japan, for example, now. I don't know if that answers all of your questions. Okay.
If you could also specify about the ethnologue and UNESCO
yes.
relevance. Thank you.
Yes and no. There have been efforts more recently. The ethnologue have tried to expand the scale, possibly to an extent where it's actually not meaningful anymore, because they've recognized that it's not real. Those scales are very, if you would call it, a blunt instrument, because they're trying to measure languages all around the world, and all the different contexts are so different. So when the United UNESCO brought out its Atlas of Endangered Languages, the people in the Isle of Man complained because their language was categorized as dead, because of the last speaker died in 1974, but actually they've got 1,500 speakers, people who've learned it and who've learned it in school, and they got really enthusiastic language revitalization movement. And so they had the editor of that atlas over to explain himself. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that UNESCO has learned, because in the next version, they're still saying the same. Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. I think it's there's also another thing called subjective language vitality, which was developed back in the 1980s. And that I think is more productive, because it's to do with how individual communities see their own languages and the prospects for their own languages. But often we find that people are very negative, particularly if they've had years and decades and hundreds of years of discrimination against their community, against their language. So this is why it's important to try to raise the prestige of languages and to get people more confident about their own heritage and their own culture. And I think we can do a lot to help with that, because I mean, you mentioned things people can do, all the different activities. Often people don't know about those, because people in small communities don't have access to academic literature. We in universities have a lot of stuff available to us that most people just don't have access to. It's often in a language they don't know, or they just don't have. They're very expensive, academic journals, apart from ones which are available in open access. We're trying to do that more and more. So yeah, we need to, I think as linguists we can help to share these things and to tell people what's going on in other places, and even just going on to ask questions about language can actually help to raise awareness and to help to raise the status of a language, actually. Okay, Ms. Sadia, would you like to say your question?
Sadia, are you here?
Okay, maybe she's given up and gone home.
Okay,
yes.
Yes, Sadia is here. Sadia is here.
Okay, yes. Hello, yes, please speak, Sadia. Yes, okay, yeah, I can see your hand up. Can you unmute?
Sadia, please unmute yourself. I think your mic is muted.
I've noticed she did write a question in the chat. Maybe she's trying to.
Yeah. Okay, well, I can read out the question and answer it. Okay. Her question is, don't you think it's the duty of older people to communicate Queen language? Do you mean English? Effectively to young people so they can communicate and transfer it effectively. I'm not really sure what you mean, Sadia. If you mean majority languages, what I'm saying with the multilingual approach is I think we need to recognize that there's a place in society for all of the languages that you need. And that you don't have to, I think linguists have been quite bad so far in getting across the advantages, benefits of multilingualism. And there are cognitive benefits and there are societal benefits for being multilingual. And you don't have to give up your home language in order to learn another language. So, you know, we can be, and actually it's been proven that bilingual children do better in other subjects, including majority languages. So actually, if you have your home language as a firm base, then you can, you actually, if it's taught well, you have to, and this is going back to the language policy question, you have to have things taught well, because
Hi,
very
Julia.
often no languages are taught very well. Sadia, thank you. Can you say something?
Thank you for all the information you just gave. I just
Okay,
wanted
thank
to
you.
share something with you. When I went to UK, a 7
Yeah.
years older girl, she said to me, "You speak Queen's language, Sadia." So, like, what she wanted to say that you are very much grammatically correct, and
Right.
you sound pretty well. On the other hand, we, the younger generation, we can't speak so nice as you are just speaking. Although she had been living there, she had nationality, English nationality. So, I just wanted to ask you basically, is it the duty of younger generation to communicate effective language like the Queen's language, or is it the older generation's duty to like communicate grammatical rules to the young ones? I'm sure you have inferred what I wanted to communicate.
Okay. So I
Thank
think
you.
there's a place for all kinds of language in our societies. There's a time and a place to speak Queen's language in a formal situation. If you're giving an academic lecture in this international context, in the British University as well, that's what you speak. You speak academic English. But if you are speaking to your family, if you are talking to your friends, it's not necessarily appropriate to speak in that way. So I think we need to be aware that everybody is at least bidialectal, and most of us are multilingual. And we need to recognize that there's a niche, a place in society for all of those ways of speaking. As to whose responsibility it is, actually, it's the whole society, because this is one of the problems with Fishman's focus on the family, is that in many societies, it's not just parents who teach their children to speak. Children learn from each other, children learn from schools, children learn from other people, everyone in society, to speak in different ways. And everyone learns through their socialization what is the appropriate way of speaking in each context. And what is important is to know when to speak in what way and where to speak in what way. I hope that's helpful. I think it's all of our responsibility. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Do you agree with me if I would say that by deliberate effort to speak effective grammar rules or to communicate equally well, we would be saving the language, the original one?
Which language are you talking about?
I'm talking about, at the moment, I'm talking about English.
English not under threat. Okay. I think no, frankly, I'm afraid. No, I don't agree with that, because for one thing, grammar, as a linguist, what we recognize is that each way of speaking has its own grammar. When we talk about grammar, we don't necessarily just mean what is called correct grammar. That's a certain dialect, actually. And that's a dialect which has become powerful through politics and through social, particular language policies. But there are other ways of speaking which are just as valid in their own context. I think it's important that children learn to read and write so-called correct English or Urdu or whatever it is, because they will need that in their life if they want to get a good job. But they should also learn to communicate with their grandparents and to speak in other ways and other languages and other dialects when it's appropriate to do that as well. I think if someone can only speak very formal English, then they'll come across as rather strange in other aspects of their life.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do we have more questions? What time is it? Okay, yeah. We've got 10 minutes left, I think. Okay.
Should I read or?
Yes, please. Yes, you choose the next one.
Can language with low prestige from socioeconomic perspectives be revitalized? If yes, how can a shift in ideology about such language or language be made? This question is linked to your prestige from the bottom up, a review of language.
I wrote that paper about 15 years ago, so I don't necessarily remember it very well, I'm afraid. And it was one of while I was doing my PhD. Yes, okay, so yes, we at that time actually, I think there are a lot fewer speakers of that language now, unfortunately. What I found was when I first started my PhD, I was looking at the attitudes towards the language, and it had very, very low prestige. But we had anecdotal kind of reports that the attitudes towards the language in society were getting more positive, because people were realizing that they were losing it, and so they wanted to do something to save it. And I went to various concerts and activities and things about that. And what I found was that I went around talking to people about their language experiences, about their linguistic repertoires, etc., everything about the language. And I found basically that what I was doing was actually raising awareness myself. So I think, as I said, going to a place, talking to people about their language as an outsider can actually help to raise awareness and also to raise the social prestige of a language. And I think that is actually, it's essential. You know, you can't really get people involved without trying to raise the shift, without trying to change the ideologies about languages. If people persist in thinking that if they, like my own mother said, our language was holding us back, you know. And that was when I first started to be interested in language revitalization. But that attitude has changed a lot nowadays. And even getting a doctorate by studying this language has actually helped to increase the prestige of that language. So my colleague Justyna Olko in Poland, my co-author for this latest book, she does this a lot. She helps to support indigenous language scholars who study their own languages and take those materials and those results back to their communities to help to support to raise the prestige of the language and the community as well. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Yeah. Just talking about language helps, you know, getting people aware of it. Okay. It's time for a couple more. There's a couple more people with raised hands. Should we have some live questions? Is it Afshan Abbas? And one more. There's a queue here.
Yes. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Actually, I'm concerned about the linguistic landscape, the term which you have used in your presentation. So should you define it for me? And secondly, how it is connected with ecolinguistics? Thank you.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. Okay, so the definition people often use is basically like the print environment. Is what languages you see if you walk down the street, if you see a shop sign, what languages are there? If you go into the shop, what labels are there on packages in the shop? If you look at the road signs, what languages are they written in, and so on. And they can be both public, if you like, official signs, and also private signs, like shopkeepers, for example. And you can look at them in various ways. There have been books written about this. Personally, I think we ought to also include the audio language landscape as well. So what languages do you hear in the environment? I mean, often, mostly, it's the visual kind of linguistic scene that people are looking at with regard to linguistic landscape. Ecolinguistics has been attempted to, well, there are two aspects of ecolinguistics. One is the ecology of languages, which is basically similar to linguistic repertoires, what niches different languages have in the society. The other aspect of ecolinguistics is to link language vitality with linguistic diversity with other kinds of ecological diversity in the world. And there have been correlations. And back in 2003, there was a very influential paper in the journal Nature, which correlated the numbers of languages as counted by Ethnologue in particular countries with the numbers of different plant and animal species in those countries, and there was a correlation. So Indonesia, for example, has got a very high number of languages, very high number of linguistic, a very high number of other species. And that became quite influential because it was, I think actually people felt that was a less threatening way to look at language endangerment than actually to look at language policies, because you know, it's safer to think about furry animals than it is to think about actually oppression of people as the cause of language endangerment. So I think it was a bit of a red herring, a bit of a side path. I think it's much more important to think about language for community development and empowerment.
Let me add something. Sean, there's a paper by Spectrum Kungus, Linguistic Diversity and Biological Diversity Parallel. I think Skutnap Kungus made this approach.
Yeah. There's a website, a community organization called Terralingua, who are very keen on that aspect. Yeah, and there's a book called Ecolinguistics by Mulhoisler and Phil. Okay, there's one other. I think Shahida has put her hand down. I've been in contact with Shahida already, so I can talk to you offline if you like. Does anybody else want to ask anything?
Mavish.
Okay. There's lots of things. Oh, Shahida's question is: can an extinct language that doesn't have literature be revived? Yes, people doing that in Australia. Yes, people are they use personal names. They use place names. They use other languages in the area, contact languages. Yes, and they try to recover as much of the language as they can, and they try to reconstruct it. There's a bit of it, particularly in Australia, there's a fair amount of documentation of that. If you're interested, I can give you some, if you want to email me, Shahida. Okay. Akanksha, how can Indigenous languages be saved when the intergenerational transfer has been lost? Yes, well, I described one possibility of that, which was the master apprentice method, where a young person visits an older person, perhaps their grandparents, or another person's grandparents if they don't have their own. But this is why I haven't mentioned adult language learning, but I think it's really important to develop the people of childbearing age, the people who go out to work, the people who can become teachers, because you can't teach children if you don't have adults who speak the language. So that's really, I think, the first thing to do is to get a core of fluent adults to speaking and using the language, and then they can, if they want to, go on to become teachers. Okay. Asim, do you agree with the view that people learn languages due to the instrumental reasons? Languages have to offer more than just identity, tradition, heritage, etc. Well, yes and no. These are two views of language, right? That people learn it because they want a job, etc., or people learn it because they want to become part of that community. I've actually written something with Jeanette King about this, which is not published yet, but we're looking at this particularly. What are the motivations of people who want to learn small languages? Because, as you say, they are not seen as being very useful in the job market. Although I have to say that my heritage language has been very useful in my job. I've risen through my academic career on the back of doing all my study of my heritage language. So yes, it was useful for me. In the Second World War, the Navajo language in America was used as a code. You may have seen the film with Nicolas Cage. It's about Native American people speaking their language, and it was never broken as a code because it doesn't work in the same way as a normal code. So that was an instrumental way of using a highly endangered language as well in the Second World War. But it is important to think of the identity value of language. And often in communicative language teaching, we forget about the actual identity value of language. And most of when we talk in everyday life, we're not just transmitting information. Most of what we do is we're using languages for friendship, for gossip, for maintaining relationships with people. So actually the relationship aspects of language are really, really important, the identity functions of language. It's not all about instrumental reasons. And so we need languages that we can express our emotions in. And I found it very, very satisfying to learn my heritage language, to relearn it, because I'm one of these people who heard it a bit when I was young. And when I tried to relearn it, oh yes, it all comes back to me. And now I know what it was, those words that were going around in my head ever since I was young. Yeah. And this has been I found that great. It's like the fuzzy feeling in my stomach. So I can't stress too much the importance for personal empowerment as well as community empowerment, for having a language that you identify with and that you can use to communicate with your friends and family. Okay, I think we need to stop because it's 1:30. I think people have other places they need to go to. I do. I have to go back to work.
Thank you indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, it's been great to discuss things with you.
Thank you for
I think it's being recorded, yes. Tura will share the recording in due course when it's ready.
Yeah, I'll share the recording and slides as well. And some of the participants are asking that how can we get updated about such webinars and such events. You can follow our page. I will be sharing through the email.
You can join the society.
Yeah, they can join the society. And please do not forget to fill the survey form for e-certificates. And I think Muhammad Asim was having some questions. Muhammad Asim, were your questions answered?
I've got lots of questions.
Questions. Actually, we missed one of his questions.
I'm sorry. Okay. Well,
yeah. Do you
I can't do everything.
No, it was a previous question. And let me, if we
there was something about a test program about an NGO teaching in languages of children. Okay.
No.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, I'd be interested in hearing information about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you guide about the difference between models and framework of language revitalization? Are these same or different in your views? This was the question, probably.
I can't find that question. Sorry.
It's, it was asked. Can you guide about the difference between models and frameworks?
Right. Okay. I don't care about. I'm not really one for terminology. People often use the same different words because it's seen as important to create a new terminology. But models, frameworks, I wouldn't worry about the difference between them. No, just get on and do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Julia, for such an enlightening talk. And indeed, it was very helpful. It also provides some insights for my research. As you know, that I'm doing my PhD on linguistic landscape. It was wonderful to know about insights. Yeah. So
okay,
thank
I'd be
you.
Interested in that. Yeah. Because I couldn't find any examples of linguistic landscape in Pakistan it wasn't just Urdu and English. So I'd be interested in seeing that.
I will share a lot of examples because I'm particularly looking for the like endangered languages, English and Urdu with respect to regional languages in the linguistic landscape, and particularly with a special focus on divergence and some challenges to these to the prestige of these languages, Urdu and English. So I will share a lot of examples with you from my own research. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you all of the participants, and thank you again for your interest in our upcoming webinar.
That's great.
And you can join our society. I'll share the link with of this session recording and also about upcoming events. So stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Allah Hafiz.